Hi, everyone. Today I am going to talk about some cultural and chemical strategies for managing insect pests of trees in urban landscapes. So we're going to talk a little bit about why some of the insects that we battle on a daily basis are so problematic, and then some ways that we may be able to counter those problems in the short term and in the long term. So my name is Adam Dale. I am the turf and ornamental entomologist from the University of Florida, based out of Gainesville, Florida. And my lab studies insects and plants in urban ecosystems. So we specifically study how insects and plants interact so that we can better understand the ways that they interact and why some insects and plants do so well and some insects and plants do not. Uh, to address these issues, we work on short-term and long-term solutions to figure out some short-term ways that we can safely and efficiently reduce damaging pests. And that's things like doing insecticide efficacy trials and evaluating some of those immediate solutions. And then we do other research to develop more long-term ecologically based solutions to incorporate cultural practices into our management programs. And these span multiple systems where we have turf and ornamental plants from residential lawns, golf courses, sod farms, and urban forests. We also try to make as much of the information associated with the research we do available through extension resources, whether that's industry publications, magazine articles, blog posts, or just extension articles and fact sheets that are accessible online. So I pulled this first image up here just to emphasize the value and quantity of trees in urban ecosystems. So these are two aerial photos, one from Raleigh, North Carolina, and one from Gainesville, Florida, both places that I have called home. But when you think about a city, not everyone always thinks about the trees that make up that city. And there are, in fact, forests in cities. And these urban forests provide a lot of benefits that benefit us directly, but also benefit the environment and wildlife. So trees and shrubs and lawns, they reduce temperatures, they filter the air, they filter rainwater, they provide aesthetic enhancement and recreational space. And all these places have known and well-documented benefits to human mental and physical health. This is particularly important because over 80% of Americans live in urban landscapes. In Florida, we've got roughly 22 million people, and 90% of those 22 million people live among urban and residential areas. So these places where these plants exist and the plants that we're specifically managing, those plants and their health and the way that we take care of those plants have a huge impact on the majority of people. So it's an extremely important system. And it's the most rapidly expanding ecosystem in the United States. Unfortunately, as many of you are probably well aware, insect pests are often more abundant and damaging on urban plants than they are on the same types of plants in natural systems. So you've got azalea lacebugs, scale insects of many kinds, and these things are frequently more abundant and damaging on urban than rural or natural trees. And we're going to talk about several of these pests today and some strategies for managing them. One of the reasons why these pests become so abundant and damaging in urban and residential areas is because urban landscapes are, by definition, pretty disturbed landscapes. They're harsh environments. So if you look at this figure on the right of your screens, this illustrates some of the main differences in urban and natural areas. So on the top right, you can see a road with some trees, lawn, and a parking deck. And directly beneath that photograph is a thermal image depicting how those surfaces translate to temperature. And it's pretty clear there that the road and the parking garage are significantly warmer than the vegetation. This is directly translating to effects on the plants and the insects that are living in and feeding on those plants. And we'll talk about some of those effects here shortly. There are other reasons why insects might outbreak in these developed disturbed landscapes, other than environmental factors. Also, the types of plants that we choose, the way that we plant them, and the management inputs that go into those spaces. But since these are such disturbed landscapes, insect pests are frequently reducing the benefits that those plants provide and require more intensive management. I think it's always important along those lines to think about all the factors that are at play when you're managing specific plant pests. So it's important to think pretty broadly about how the cultural and maintenance practices of that area, how the environmental conditions, how the weather, all these things are interacting with each other to affect how insects are feeding on the plants that you're interested in. So it's never a one-track problem where you can come in and treat a plant with an insecticide to solve the problem in the long term and prevent that problem from reoccurring. It's typically a combination of stress, cultural management practices, and the inputs that are going into that system. Since urban landscapes are so highly disturbed, and we frequently see pest outbreaks, there's frequent need for intervention to manage those pests. So in areas where you've got high disturbance, either created by roads and parking lots and buildings, or fragmented habitat where you've got little patches of trees and shrubs, or the maintenance inputs in those areas, these insect pests can capitalize on those factors, and that's when we've got to come in and control them. As you should all be well familiar, integrated pest management, or IPM, is the best way to approach that, and it's a way of thinking about solving these problems that's really necessary to get a sustainable and long-term control or handle on these situations. And this is where it becomes particularly important to realize that multiple factors are at play in these landscapes to keep the plant pests in balance and below damaging levels. So you've got to think about how your pest management decisions may affect the landscape's ecosystem and all these plant insect environment interactions, how they may affect your wallet as a pest manager or your client's wallet, and how these things all affect the people in that system. And with an IPM approach, you've got to incorporate these multiple strategies to preventively manage pests with reduced inputs. So when it comes to intervening in a pest outbreak, there are 4 general forms of intervention that you can and should incorporate simultaneously in one program. So you've got cultural practices, mechanical control, biological, and chemical control. Chemical control is not absent from IPM. It's often misunderstood as chemical. IPM programs are often misunderstood to be void of chemical use, but pesticides are an integral component of IPM. It's only using them appropriately and when needed that's the most important. So spot treat plants when you can, actively monitor and know when you have damaging populations or when those pest populations are in a very susceptible stage, and use the most appropriate formulation or application method to minimize risk to yourself and other organisms or other people in that system. So when it comes to insecticides for managing pests on urban trees, These products in this table are some of our best or standard go-to products that have historically been the best option for us over the past couple of decades. And as you all, I'm sure, are pretty well familiar, these are all the neonicotinoids, which are among the most commonly used insecticides in the world to target a lot of these plant pests. And so these products are excellent tools for controlling insect pests because of several reasons. First, they're highly selective for the target pest and the target insects, so they have relatively low vertebrate toxicity. So non-target mammals and fish and other vertebrates and the applicators are relatively safe. There's also low topical and residue toxicity. So after you make an application, toxicity to non-target beneficial insects like the predators and prey is relatively low. These products are relatively affordable as well, so most landscape managers can afford to purchase these and use them in their programs. One of the more important characteristics of neonicotinoids is they're systemic. So they get taken up into the plant tissue, and then when insects feed on those plants, they ingest the toxins and are exposed to them. That means that beneficial insects like predators and parasitoids that are not typically feeding on the plant are very minimally exposed to that toxicity, and therefore they can prey on herbivores and not get exposed to that insecticide. They also have very extended residual activity, so you get decent or very good control of those pests with one application over several weeks. There are, as with everything, there are disadvantages to neonicotinoids as well. So since they work so well and they're relatively affordable, efficacy typically translates or has translated to overuse. So a lot of pest control applicators will repeatedly use neonicotinoids and therefore increasing the risk for insecticide resistance development. So it's critical to incorporate more than one active ingredient or more than one chemical class into these programs. More recently, we've been hearing a lot about risks to pollinators and other beneficial insects associated with these systemic insecticides. And since these products get into the plant tissue and are exposed to organisms feeding on the plants, there's also some exposure to insects feeding on pollen and nectar. So insects like bees that pick up the pollen and nectar may experience sublethal chronic effects that have long-term effects on their populations. So because of that, I think it's critical that everyone consider and incorporate other products, other chemical classes into their toolbox so that they can be prepared to use things when neonicotinoids may not be the best option or may not be a viable option in a specific situation. For example, if plants are flowering and you can't apply these products to them. One group of insecticides that are an excellent option are these low impact pesticides. These are the insecticidal oils and horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps, biological products like bacteria and fungi, naturally derived products from soils or other plants. These products are excellent tools because they can control pests with limited to no potential for developing resistance to them. There are setbacks to these though. They break down much more rapidly in the environment. So you've got to make more frequent applications, and the environmental conditions like humidity and temperature need to be ideal as well. So I've put a list of products here and trying to highlight the importance for us to consider alternative chemistries when deciding on how to manage these insect pests. So in this top box, we've got our standard go-to products that we've been using for several years and are kind of the go-to product for the homeowner or the pest control operator. Carbamates and pyrethroids, these are the broad spectrum contact toxic products that can be effective for providing rapid knockdown. However, they are not selective for the target pest, so you get a lot of non-target effects. Neonicotinoids are a go-to, and I just discussed several reasons why they are an excellent tool, but some of the downsides and drawbacks to those. This bottom box are some products that I think are moving towards how the pest control industry should control pests with reduced risks to themselves and other organisms. So insect growth regulators like pyriproxyfen and buprofuscin, these are old chemistries. However, they're highly effective on several plant pests that we commonly encounter on urban trees. Small risk to non-target organisms. Some newer chemistries are the anthranilic diamides and the butynylides. Both of these are systemic products that have reduced risk to beneficial insects, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. It's also important to be aware of the EPA reduced risk products. These are products that the Environmental Protection Agency has lumped together because they've identified them as safer to humans. They have lower non-target toxicity risks. They have low potential for groundwater contamination. You can use them at lower rates, and they're generally more compatible with IPM. So I've listed just a handful of examples here on the right of some common turf and ornamental products that are reduced risk, but also effective on a wide range of insect pests. So first, I just want to briefly touch on a few newer products that are available to the industry and have shown some promise in terms of efficacy, but also in terms of reduced risk to beneficial insects and non-target organisms. So mainspring GNL, the active ingredient here is cyantriniloprol. This is one of the anthranilic diamides. It was released in early 2016 to the turf and ornamental industry. It's labeled for nurseries, landscapes, greenhouses, and interior-scapes. This is a true systemic insecticide that primarily targets sap-feeding pests and can be foliarly or applied as a drench. This product can work pretty well, but it's important to note that it's more of a preventive product rather than a curative product. So if you come into a situation where you have an elevated pest abundance, they're causing damage, this isn't something that you would put out to knock those pests back and then provide extended control. This is something that you put out preventively to prevent those pests from becoming damaging. We did a trial using this last year where we evaluated how well it worked on chili thrips. So this is a thrips primarily distributed throughout Florida and parts of Georgia, Alabama, and the Southeast. This is extremely prolificous, so it feeds on over 100 plant species and can cause a lot of plant damage on the new growth. And in extreme situations lead to entire plant defoliation. So the best way to look for these is look for that characteristic scarring on the leaves. And then when you identify that, they can be targeted historically with soaps, oils, and a handful of insecticides. Their favorite food source throughout the Southeast is Indian hawthorn and roses. And they cause this characteristic scarring that you can see here in the top right. And so these are attacked by a really common predatory insect called the minute pirate bug, or Aureus insidiosus. However, these often don't provide enough control to keep them below damaging levels. So it's great to be able to incorporate chemical options that can facilitate this biological control by these insects. So we tested a few products. Spinosad, Conserve is the trade name for that, as well as imidacloprid and cyantriniloprol, this new mainspring product. Bifenthrin and the pyrethroids are also occasionally recommended for these. However, uh, we only tested those in the lab and not in the field. The main point that I want to drive home is that cyantraniliprole or mainspring can be highly effective at protecting plants from chili thrips. However, it does depend on the rate at which it is applied. So this figure shows the percentage of a plant of the Indian hawthorn shrubs with feeding damage from chili thrips 42 days after we made our treatment application. And what this shows is our untreated control on the left, our low rate at 2 ounces per 100 gallons of mainspring, a high rate at 8 ounces per 100 gallons of mainspring, and then spinosad at 4 ounces per 100 gallons. And what you can see here is that we generally didn't see any effect except for mainspring at the high rate, which protected the plants significantly better than the untreated controls. And so when you're thinking about how to come in and intervene in these thrips pest situations, spinosad, which is conserve, is a great go-to. However, it provides only about a 7-day window of residual control. And so if you come into a situation where you have elevated thrips abundance, spinosad can be an excellent tool for knocking that population back. And then followed with an application of mainspring at 8 ounces per 100 gallons to give you that 42-day period of protection. Our laboratory and field evaluations found that both had minimal toxicity to natural enemies. So both facilitate that biological control in combination with the direct effect of the chemicals. In addition to mainspring, this product, Altus, which is fluopyridifurone, this is newer than mainspring. It was released last May in 2017. It's currently only labeled for nurseries and greenhouses, but it is also a true systemic product that's a reduced risk insecticide, primarily effective on sap feeding pests. So this product's main selling point is that it can be applied to flowering plants. So although it's a true systemic, it doesn't have the bee box and pollinator protection labeling that the other systemics like neonicotinoids do. So this can be an effective option for protecting the plants against sap feeding pests. We're currently conducting some evaluations with this product on scale insects, but we do not have those results quite yet. So when you're coming into these situations and you have to intervene to reduce the damaging pest populations, it's always critical that you incorporate and follow these steps of IPM where you're monitoring, scouting, and making sure you've identified the target pest correctly. Making insurance calendar-based broad spectrum applications is not the way to ensure these non-target effects are prevented. But also, you've got to target these pests when they're there. As I mentioned before, you've got to always also consider incorporating all 4 management forms, so cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical. Think about things like right plant, right place, and proper maintenance practices to minimize plant stress and the conditions that may be favorable for pest populations. And based on your monitoring, scouting, and identification, make these chemical applications when you need to rather than on a schedule. One term that's important to be aware of and also important to be cognizant of in these management situations are secondary pests. So secondary pests are insects that are typically present in the system, but they remain below damaging levels until some disturbance removes them from that control. And so these disturbances may be habitat loss or habitat change. They may be a pesticide application a broad spectrum application that knocks the system out of whack. But they also may be environmental condition changes. And so these things are always there, but they become problematic in response to something. And so a lot of the pests that we frequently manage are secondary pests, and these include things like scale insects and spider mites. And so we've seen that spider mites on maple trees, for example, can outbreak and cause a lot of damage following cover spray applications of pyrethroids. So pyrethroid sprays to the canopies of maple trees targeting other insect pests end up killing off the naturally occurring predators that control these spider mites. And therefore, the surviving spider mites are able to feed and reproduce in enemy-free space. And so as a result, you get these booms in spider mite populations and their associated plant damage. This translates to reduced plant quality, reduced health, and the need for additional pesticide applications to control the mites. Other examples of secondary pest outbreaks that are not associated with insecticide applications can be associated with environmental conditions. So other research has shown that some scale insects in urban areas, so areas that are very heavily developed, for example, in the middle of a parking lot, the scale insects on those parking lot trees may develop more rapidly than the scale insects on the trees that may border a forest. And so as a result, they escape some of that parasitism and predation that occurs naturally, and they're able to produce eggs and offspring before the parasitoids develop and are able to attack them. So we see more scale insects at warmer sites, more developed sites, because these scale insects develop more rapidly and produce their offspring before the biological control organisms can come in there and control them. Do any of these look familiar? I'm assuming that several of you have seen these before, or at least tried to control them once or twice. So as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, these are all scale insects, and perhaps JC has shown you several of these already as well. So these are one of the more common, the more ubiquitous, and difficult to control secondary pests in urban landscapes and on ornamental plants that we have out there. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors, and so it can be relatively difficult to keep up with identifying all of them. So there are about 8,000 species of scale insects out there. They're predominantly made of composed of two groups: the armored scales, the diaspidids, and the soft scales, which are the coccids. Here in Florida, we have nearly 200 species in our state alone, which can make things a little challenging when you're thinking about controlling these pests or identifying them in particular. In general, scale insects are divided into two main categories. We've got the armored scales and the soft scales. I'm not going to go through too much detail about these different classifications, but it's important to be able to differentiate these, as their management can be different depending on the group that they fall in. In general, there are four main differences between armored scales and soft scales. One, soft scales are feeding on phloem within the plant vascular tissue, and armored scales are feeding on individual cells. So since the soft scales are feeding on the phloem, they're typically ingesting a lot more fluid, a lot more sugar and nutrients, and as a result, they are the ones that are excreting that honeydew and covering other surfaces beneath them with that sticky honeydew substance. Since armored scales are feeding on individual cells, they excrete their waste as their armored covering, because they don't have as much excess to put out. Because of that, the armored covering on armored scales is actually separate from their body. so you can physically remove the armored scale covering, whereas soft scales, their waxy covering is part of their body. So they're all one piece. The final main difference between the two groups is armored scales. The females are immobile once they begin to feed. So the crawlers, the first instar nymphs, the crawlers, they emerge from the female, crawl over, find a place to feed, insert their mouth part into the plant tissue, lose their legs, lose their antennae, and just become a little blob feeding on the plant tissue. They spend the rest of their life sitting here feeding. Soft scales, on the other hand, are mobile during multiple periods, particularly the ones that transition from the bark to leaves in the spring and then back to the bark in the fall before the leaves senesce. There are, of course, exceptions to all these rules, as there are with any insect scenario. However, these are 4 good general guidelines to follow when thinking about how to identify these two groups. So there are entire textbooks dedicated to the identification of armored scale insects and soft scale insects. So even folks like myself or JC or Shamat are not able to identify all scale insects on site. And many of them have to be identified by experts by putting them on slides and looking at them under a microscope. This is just a snapshot of some of the common armored scales that I see in the Southeast. So we've got false oleander scale, T-scale on the bottom right, Asian cycad scale on the bottom right, and Florida red scale on the top right. There are also a handful of, or a diversity of soft scales, including calico scale, magnolia scale, different wax scales, oak lecanium scales. All of these are very frequently found in the landscape. And here's just a snapshot at those. We have Florida wax scale on the top, tulip tree scale on the bottom left, and hemispherical scale on the bottom right. There are other scale insect groups I originally showed you on that slide. Caryids, the lac scales. These are a more tropical scale insect. We have some in Florida. Cottony cushion scale is one that we see frequently. And then mealybugs are a common problem and more similar to soft scales than armored scales. Just as some resources, my lab has just put out a couple of comprehensive articles on crepe myrtle bark scale and tulip tree scale. And you can find more information on each of those at these links here on the screen. So coming back to this diagram that I originally showed you, I want you to keep thinking about how these environmental and site-specific conditions may affect the insects and the plants that are occurring in those areas. So on the top here we have an aerial satellite photo of Raleigh, North Carolina, and we have a ground photo of a road and parking garage. If you look directly beneath those photos, I've converted each of those to a thermal image. So the satellite image, you can see that the paved areas, the buildings, roads, parking lots, the airport, those all translate to hot, warmer temperatures, and the green trees and vegetation translates to cooler blue temperatures. You can see this same exact translation and trend on the right, although it's a higher resolution, and you can really see how those surfaces change to really hot or relatively cool temperatures. One thing that we have seen in multiple situations is that when you transition from those cool areas to the hot areas, some scale insect pests really outbreak and do better. So here on the left, we have some figures that illustrate this response in oak lecanium scale on oak trees. So the blue bars are trees in areas that are not very heavily developed. So these are consisted of a lot of vegetation and just a little bit of paved surfaces. And what you see is that the scale insects in the really hot, highly developed areas are way more abundant than those in the natural areas. This figure on the right shows how gloomy scales respond to that on maple trees. And so as you see here on the horizontal axis, as urban development increases, you get a significant increase in the abundance of these scale insects. And so this is just emphasizing how important it is to be able to effectively manage scale insects on urban trees, because the more urban you are, the more likely you are to find these pests and have to manage them. And so proper identification of the pest, is it an armored scale or a soft scale, and knowing what life stage that pest is in are critical for being successful in your efforts to control those. Despite this and our knowledge of the different products and methods for controlling these insects, insecticide control can be extremely expensive. It can take a lot of time and a lot of money, and therefore heavy infestations may not be the most practical approach. It may be better just to replace the plant in general. To emphasize this, we did an insecticide trial on gloomy scale, an armored scale insect that's present throughout the southeastern U.S. And the eastern U.S. And its favorite host plant is red maple trees. And so we tested several insecticides and application techniques to control this pest. And I'm not going to go through all the nitty-gritty details of this, but what I want to emphasize is that when we were evaluating our results based on these applications, we didn't find that any of these products made a difference in scale insect abundance until over a year after our initial application. So it takes a lot of time to come into a situation and intervene and reduce armored scale insect populations. We did find a difference, and we found that these insect growth regulators like talus and distance, and one of the neonicotinoids, thiamethoxam, both were effective at reducing these pests. But again, it took multiple applications and it took over a year to see any kind of results. So scale can be a long-term commitment and often not feasible. And as I'm sure many of you are well aware, the clients aren't typically willing to wait 400 some days to see a reduction and an improvement in that plant's health. And even beyond seeing a reduction in those pests, it's going to typically take longer to see an improvement in plant quality. And so what we really need to think about and work towards are developing landscape design or cultural practices that can help mitigate these negative effects and prevent scale insect populations from becoming so abundant and damaging over time. And so based on everything I've been telling you about how the local environment, the site characteristics all translate to insects and plants, it's pretty clear that landscape design affects the future management needs of a site. And so as does plant selection, the way we plant those trees or shrubs, site prep, and all of these factors that go into creating that ornamental planting. So how can we learn from those current designs, current landscapes, and develop future ones that are going to cause less problems in the long run? And so just for definition's sake, this is all coming back to cultural control practices. So if you flash back to the 4 ways of intervening in an IPM program, cultural control strategies are the #1 way to start. These are the maintenance practices that go into maintaining the plants in that landscape and manipulating surrounding habitat to promote plant health and reduce pest abundance. So this is putting the right plant in the right place, implementing any kind of host plant resistance that can be implemented, and minimizing plant stress where possible. So proper fertilization practices, proper irrigation practices, putting plants in dry areas that can tolerate drought. These are all going to affect the quality of that plant, but also the future management needs that that plant may have. So cultural control of sap-feeding pests like these scale insects comes back to how that site has been prepared, how that plant has been put in the ground, and how it has been maintained for the next several years. And this all we always hear, right plant, right place, is because of these reasons. You've got to set those plants up for success to prevent future management needs. However, we don't have a lot of tools that can tell us what the right plant is for that plant, or what the right site is for that plant. And so what we really need and what we're working towards developing are guidelines to help inform exactly what right plant, right place means. And so I'm going to walk you through a case study of how we can work towards developing these cultural strategies to inform right plant, right place, and inform our cultural practices to prevent our need to come in and manage these pests down the road and spend a lot of money and a lot of time reducing pest populations to maintain some quality of plant health. So we're going to talk about gloomy scale. This is a native armored scale insect and a common and damaging pest of urban and residential maple trees. It's distributed throughout the southeastern United States and has spread even further north and west than this image on the bottom right depicts. This is an armored scale, so as you can see in this bottom image, you can physically remove that armored covering and see that little blob of an insect beneath it feeding on the plant. As I've been mentioning multiple times, impervious surfaces translate to warmer temperatures. So as you can see in the photos I've been showing you, those thermal images, this directly translates to warmer temperatures. So this figure at the left on the horizontal axis, this is the percentage surface around a tree. And then on the vertical axis is that tree canopy's temperature. And as you can see, as impervious surface increases, the temperature within the canopy of that tree is also increasing. What we have seen over time is that in response to that increase in tree canopy temperature, now on the horizontal axis, scale insects like gloomy scale respond to that and become up to 200 times more abundant across a 2-degree increase in temperature. Through multiple studies, what we've been able to find is that gloomy scales are affected in that their egg production changes at warmer temperatures. So this is an adult female gloomy scale, and if you stare at it hard enough, you can start to see these little purple oval shapes within that adult female's body. And those are the individual embryos and egg cells developing within that adult female. And what we have seen is that when adults become mature, they produce all their offspring, and immediately before the crawlers begin to emerge from that adult female, the eggs that she has produced are directly related to the temperature in that tree's canopy. And so across the same temperature increase on the horizontal axis, you get a significant increase in egg production. So for every 1 degree increase in tree canopy temperature, an adult female gloomy scale is going to produce about 14 more eggs per individual female. And that's what translates to that 200 times more abundant pest infestation on these hotter trees. So in summary, temperature in these urban landscapes, depending on the amount of impervious surface cover, will increase up to 3 degrees Celsius. corresponding to that temperature increase, we have an increase in scale insect abundance. And those gloomy scales are bigger at warmer sites, and they're producing more offspring at those warmer sites, largely because it's warmer. We also know that temperature or that drought affects sap feeding pests. And so that periods of drought may alter the nutrient content in these trees and therefore benefit these scale insects as well. So whether it's due to prolonged periods of not enough water or pulsed periods of not enough water followed by enough water. In many cases, in other systems, we see sap feeding pests benefit from this stress on the plants. And so to figure out if this is a part of the system we're observing, if it also affects these gloomy scales, we did an experiment where we watered and did not water trees at hot and cold locations along streets. And so we put these green irrigation bags on the base of these maple trees, watered them twice a week, May through August, for 2 years in North Carolina. And we tracked scale insect development and drought stress in these trees. And so we know previously that scale insect egg production increases with temperature, and that translates to greater populations on warmer trees. So now, is egg production affected by this difference in irrigation treatments? And so what we found supported that and ultimately showed that hotter, drier trees produce scale insects, or scale insects feeding on trees that are hotter and drier produce about 6% individual than scale insects on cooler, irrigated trees. So this dotted line represents those hot, dry trees, the scale insects on those hot, dry trees, and the solid line represents scale insects on cooler, irrigated trees. So temperature and drought translate to more egg production in these gloomy scale insects. In addition to scale insects and plant pests, we know that impervious surfaces and drought and temperature can affect trees directly as well. And ultimately, what people are concerned about and interested in is the quality and longevity of these urban trees. And so we're also interested in how these conditions may affect the trees themselves. So to get at this, we went around and surveyed the condition of red maple trees in Raleigh and looked at to see how that condition was associated with scale insect abundance and the temperature in those locations. And so we rated trees as excellent, good, fair, or poor based on the quality of those leaves, trunks, stems, how much dieback they had, and really tried to capture the relationship between temperature, scale insect, and tree condition. So this gives an example of an excellent and a poor tree. Pretty clear distinction there. But what we found ultimately was that red maple trees in hot sites have more scale insects, but they're also in worse condition than those in cooler sites. So red maple, we have over twice as many red maple trees in poor condition at the hot sites than we do at the cold sites, and nearly twice as many trees in excellent condition at the cold sites than we do at the hot sites. And so we know that temperature, drought stress, and scale insects are translating to reduced tree condition and a elevated need to manage scale insects and trees in those sites. And so this, again, keeps coming back to right plant, right place, where proper plant selection based on that site is critical for providing a healthy plant that gives long-term benefits. And we know that different tree species have evolved to tolerate certain conditions, whether that's temperature, soil conditions, water availability. These things are all critical at affecting those trees, and some are better than others at handling those. And so when you think about the different conditions that I've been talking about at these sites, uh, most of you probably aren't going to go out and record the hourly tree canopy temperature within each tree you're managing, and then look at those data to determine whether or not you should monitor those trees more, or those trees are going to need more pest control efforts. Uh, I imagine most of you don't have time to do that. But what you can do is look at each of these photos and pick out something that is measurable, and measurable in a relatively quick sense. And so we started thinking about this and started to wonder if there was a threshold at which impervious surface around a tree started to become damaging. And so to address this, we decided to develop planting recommendations to address that right plant, right place concept based on the amount of impervious surface around that planting site. And to do this for the people designing these landscapes, but also for the people maintaining these spaces. And so this is a satellite or GIS image of Raleigh, North Carolina, with that heat map overlaid onto it. And then each dot here is a red maple tree, a red maple street tree. And so what we did is we took a subset of these trees, we calculated the percentage of impervious surface around each of those trees, and then looked at the relationship between the amount of impervious surface and the condition of that tree to say, okay, so as the percentage of impervious surface increases, does the condition rating of that tree change in a predictable way? And so this next figure is pretty crazy looking, but let me walk you through it so that you aren't overwhelmed. So here on the x-axis, we have the percent impervious surface around a tree. On the y-axis, or the vertical axis, we have the likelihood of finding a tree in a given condition rating. Each color represents a condition rating. So you have red is excellent, green is good, blue is fair, and orange is poor. And so if we look at these condition ratings and look at how they change with the percentage of impervious surface, what we see is, if you look at the green lines, that the likelihood of finding a red maple tree in good condition pretty rapidly declines as the percentage of impervious surface around that tree increases. At the same time, trees in good condition are declining, trees in poor condition are increasing with impervious surface. And if you look close enough, you can see that there are intersections of these lines, and those are the inflection points or the thresholds of impervious surface that we're looking for. And so if you look at where the blue and green lines intersect, on average, a tree is going to be most likely in good condition until you get to that 32% impervious surface covered line. And so 32% impervious surface is our lower threshold where trees are most likely going to be transitioning from good to fair condition. At the next inflection point where blue and orange intersect, on average is about 62% impervious surface. And that is the point at which trees are most likely going to be in poor condition. And so the recommendation would be to not plant a red maple tree at a site that has more than 62% impervious surface. Ideally, your site would have less than 32% impervious surface. And so we've been testing these thresholds, trying to develop regional recommendations. And what we have found is that no matter where you are in the eastern United States, from as far north as Delaware and as far south as Florida, those thresholds remain about the same. So on average, the lower threshold is 36% and the upper threshold is about 61%. And so we can use these thresholds to inform plant selection based on the impervious surface cover at that site, with the idea that we develop a list of recommended tree species and those those ranges of impervious surface in which they can do well. And this is something we're working on currently, trying to expand on and develop recommendations for multiple species. So these thresholds are great, but not many people can use satellite imagery or GIS software to calculate percentages from an aerial image. And that's just not a practical approach for most folks, other than the designers and people developing these landscapes. And so what we wanted to do was develop a way that people on the ground making these immediate decisions and making these maintenance decisions could use our guide of threshold values and quantify the amount of impervious surface at the site. And so to get at that, I'm going to walk you through this example of one of our planting sites. So this white dot here in the middle is a red maple tree. This is a typical tree planting site with a parking lot, a road on both sides, surrounded by homes. So there's a lot of impervious surface. And if you put a 20-meter radius circle around that and look and try to figure out how much of that circle is impervious, that will give you the percentage of impervious surface around that tree or planting site. And within this circle, 66.2% of that circle is impervious surface, and therefore it's over that upper threshold. And so that red maple tree is most likely going to be in poor condition. So since most folks are not going to be able to do this from their phone or on their computer when they're at that site trying to make a decision, we wanted to develop a way that they could do that on the site. And this is using what we call the paste to plant technique. And when you're doing this at the site, you start at the tree or at the planting site, find your nearest impervious edge, which is the road here, and you walk 25 steps at a 45-degree angle to that. While you're taking those 25 steps, each step that lands on impervious surface should be counted. And so that's those are the white footsteps in this image. Go back to the tree, take 25 steps at 90 degrees to your previous path, counting the impervious steps. Do that again, counting the impervious steps, and do it again, counting the impervious steps. If you run into a building, don't keep walking, just count those as impervious. It turns out for this same site, by doing the paste to plant technique, 66 of your steps out of 100 steps land on impervious surface. And so you get a percent estimate based on the number of steps on impervious surface, which matches exactly that satellite image calculation that I just showed you. And so when you do this across a range of impervious surface cover from 20% to 92%, and is a very good predictor of impervious surface cover. So in summary, impervious surfaces increase the temperature of that tree. Those warmer temperatures increase tree drought stress, and heat and drought additively increase scale insect reproduction and abundance. We also know that heat, drought, and scale insects reduce tree condition, and ultimately, impervious surfaces translate to reduced tree condition for red maple trees. So using our right plant, right place quantification, you can plant trees in the appropriate locations based on the amount of impervious surface around those. And you can measure that impervious surface using the paste to plant technique. So again, this all comes back to cultural practices and making the right decisions from the beginning to set up those plants for success. For more information on managing scale insects and impervious surface thresholds and the paste to plant technique, I encourage you to check out these extension publications that are available through the University of Florida Extension website or my lab's website. These include more comprehensive details about what I was just describing with examples on how to implement those techniques. I also want to make sure you're aware of the 2017 Pest Management Guide. This was a guide led by J.C. Chong from Clemson, but contributed to from several of us from other universities throughout the Southeast. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. If you're interested in on Twitter, I encourage you to follow me, and I try to actively post updates on pests or relevant topics, and my lab's website, dalelab.org, where I house all of our extension resources and contact information and research. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions if I'm able to. Thank you.